active spot. And thank you very much for the opportunity to come and share this topic. I know that we have other people who have joined us online. Welcome as well. Here we have a panel of esteemed speakers who will take us through this complex topic. We have Dr. Jonathan Dipeolu, who's the Senior Lecturer for Political Economy at SOAS, University of London. SOAS has played a very incredible role in educating most bureaucrats in the economic cluster in South Africa, especially in the post-apartheid South Africa, especially the DTIC, National Treasury, as well as the Reserve Bank. So, there's wealth of knowledge that SOAS is having, and the critical role that continues to play in South Africa through the APORDE program, which is currently taking place. So it's important that we develop our skills in tackling this very important topic. The other member of the panel is Nishal Robb, who also is a graduate of SOAS at University of London and has just joined TIPS this month. Welcome. And it's the first month and we're already contributing to knowledge. The last person is Adeyemi Dipeolu, who's an advisor to the president of economic matters in Nigeria, and has done incredible work in the field of industrial policy, tax, I think oil and gas as well, in Nigeria. So you can read through his profile, and we would like to know, how also this topic is affecting Nigeria as well as an oil exporting country. So, I will then allow the panel to take us through this topic of tax avoidance. It's a very complex topic. It's evolving. The OECD, the G20 also have organized countries, I think a list of about 125 countries, which are combining to deal with the issue of tax avoidance, because it's having negative impact on economic development broadly in countries, especially the impact of base erosion and profit shifting. And Africa is it's badly affected by transfer price. So we will want to know what exactly is tax avoidance. All right, there's a thin line between evasion, avoidance, as well as tax planning. So my understanding is that the evasion is illegal, right? So it's about fraud, it's about misrepresentation. So countries have to use their law enforcement agencies, including the tax authorities, to deal with illegality. But the avoidance is not illegal per se. It's using structures, some are in law, to minimize your tax liabilities, be it your base, be it your rates. So it's very interesting, especially the avoidance one. It's complex, especially involving multinational companies. So let me not steal your thunder on that and allow the specialists to come and share with us. I will first allow Jonathan Dipeolu to present, and followed by Nishal and Adeyemi. Thereafter, we'll take questions. Over to you. So, thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan DeJohn, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to talk today very broadly about some of the political economy implications of what tax avoidance and tax evasion might mean for industrial policy. I'm not going to get into the specific technical discussions about how we measure the tax gap, that is how much tax is lost relative to what could be earned. It's very complicated, and I'm not actually sure it has either empirically or economically we've figured out why it matters, in the same way that we don't really understand why countries that have similar measurements of corruption perform very differently. The Transparency International score of China is not that different from Nigeria, or hasn't been over the years, yet one country grows at 10% a year and the other one grows at much less for long periods of time. But I'm not going to delve into that, although I'm happy to ask questions about it later on. I mean, obviously, tax is a very important part of political economy, principally because, processes of taxation are intimately related to processes of state formation and state capacity. I mean, Edmund Burke, a long time ago, argued that revenue is the chief preoccupation of the state. Name more, it is a state. If a country collects $25 per person in tax, and there are elections in that country, it's very difficult to see what a leader could do for anyone. Right? And just to put the kind of magnitude of what less development means in taxation terms, the United States, which is a relatively low tax collector in the OECD as a percentage of its national income, collects something like $8 to $9 trillion a year in tax collection. That's about 30% of US GDP. That translates into $25,000 a person in tax collection, more or less. A country like Ethiopia collects about $150 a person in tax collection. And so the differences between GDP per capita and the tax revenue per capita are vastly more different. People always compare GDP per capita across countries, but the tax differences are much more magnified. So tax is quite important in terms of what a state is capable of doing. Joseph Schumpeter argued that the fiscal history of a people is above all essential part of its general history. So there's a long pedigree of why in political theory and political economy, why taxation is so important. Now it's important for obvious reasons that we know, but I think it's important to go through some of them. Governments use tax to finance public goods, to finance public investment, social spending, and so on and so forth. And these are all importantly related to economic development through various theories of different ideological persuasions. Tax is also a key element of state building and state capacity for reasons that were just mentioned. But it's also important to remember that taxation is also constitutive not of state capacity because of the revenues it brings in, but also is constitutive of civil society development, of interest groups development. So groups organized to resist, to propose taxation policies. And actually the organization of labor unions and business associations is very much related to tax policy. Tax often gives them the impetus to organize. And a lot of, the American Revolution, for example, was built on the idea of no taxation without representation. Tax is something that binds the interests of states and citizens and states and interest groups. It creates these mutual obligations. You pay tax and in return you expect the government to do something. So in terms of this seminar, when people are, a lot of groups and individuals are avoiding tax, it's breaking that relationship between the state and citizens. So it's potentially a very serious problem for governance generally and accountability. Historically, taxation, particularly in the form of land and property tax and customs and border collections, was important for expanding the territorial reach of the state. In very fragile or collapsed states, which you often see is a state not even having a monopoly over tax collection, where there are warlords and other groups collecting tax at the border. So it's not so much necessarily about how much you collect, but does the state have a monopoly over it? That also affects the governance and political stability of the country. And so state legitimacy depends to a large degree on fiscal capacity. Representative democracy and elections are not enough. States need to deliver things by mobilizing resources. Now, in a lot of the discussions on tax collection, on taxation, there's been more of an emphasis in recent times on how much and how efficiently and how equitably governments are collecting tax. Kind of discussing tax on its own terms in isolation. However, there's another aspect of taxation that's important, and that's its developmental role. That is the link between taxation and production strategies. Alexander Hamilton, the first treasurer of the post-colonial United States, he invented the term infant industry, and he argued that the United States needs to put very high import taxes, or what we now call tariffs, on British manufacturers as a way to incentivize textile production in the United States. So, the oldest, along with land taxes, which we'll come to in a second, the tariff is one of the oldest developmental taxes because it was central feature of import substituting industrialization strategies. Land taxes have also been very important in agricultural development. I'm going to go through very briefly a wonderful article that Deborah Browdigan wrote on the role of sugar taxes, export taxes and sugar, and how it was intimately involved in the relationship with the development of Mauritius. Next time. So this idea that we need to think about how tax is linked to production strategies is quite important. Right? It's not just about collecting it for its own sake. And history provides a lot of examples of the importance of land and property taxes in enhancing the territorial and social reach of states from the United States to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. In the 50s and 60s, property taxes were much bigger than they are now, and they were a big part of funding agricultural development. And an important feature of these property taxes historically, and this is also true of Western Europe, they're not a big feature of less developed countries today, the property tax, but they were in the United States in the 19th century, property taxes were 25% of the tax base, land taxes. And when income tax came in, property tax went down. And the property tax was a very developmental tax because it was earmarked. That is, both elite, middle-sized, and small landowners could see that paying land taxes was something that benefited them because most of it was plowed back into irrigation, into infrastructure that improved their livelihoods and their productivity. And so the important feature of the land tax was part of a production strategy to improve agricultural production. These days, a lot of tax is very general, and a lot of people, the classic thing is, why should I pay tax if the government's just going to waste it or give it to someone else? So there's a legitimacy problem in collection. So I think one of the things that tax avoidance exacerbates is that we're actually not exacerbates, but it's manifest of the fact that a lot of groups don't see the benefits of paying taxation. And in less developed countries, tax evasion tends to be higher in general. And that's partially because there's less resources to provide public services to everyone and people get frustrated. Next slide. Now, Deborah Browdigan has a very nice piece on how, it's one of the nicest pieces I've read on thinking about developmental taxation. And she wrote a piece in a book which I provided a reference for on the role that export taxes played in the economic and political development of Mauritius in the 19th and 20th century. And she argued that the export tax was important because it was an effective substitute for income taxes. Low-income countries have a very hard time taxing economic elites. And so we need to think of what are substitute ways of doing that. And historically, the export tax was a way of taxing landowners because everything the export taxes are quite easy to implement, and they're very difficult to avoid, actually. And so it was an effective substitute for income taxes, and it was generally progressive as it shifted the burden of taxation onto the wealthier groups of large landowners. Secondly, the tax was used by the state, and this is why most people didn't try to evade it so much, was that it was used by the state to finance research, development, infrastructure, and marketing of sugar. And Mauritius became one of the most efficient sugar producers in the world, and the state was responsible for branding it. And a lot of the foreign exchange earnings from sugar financed a lot of the diversification of Mauritius, which has the highest per capita income in Africa. Third, the export tax helped the private sector to organize. This is a very important part of tax. Right? It built the capacity to interact with the government over time, and it helped both the state and society solve collective action problems. That is, tax creates a voice and a dialogue between the state and interest groups. When that's broken, it's very difficult to do industrial policy. And finally, the export tax helped develop the territorial reach of the states as the tax affected the main employer in the countryside and promoted mutually beneficial rights and obligations between state and farmers, both large and small. Now, of course, tax avoidance, and without getting into the difference between avoidance and evasion, both of them can negatively affect development in several ways. One way is it can reduce private national savings and investment as a result of capital flight. Most studies by, for example, Boyce and Kumana and others have pointed out that sub-Saharan private citizens in sub-Saharan Africa have offshore holdings that are higher than all of sub-Saharan Africa's private debt, public debt. So it's not that savings is a problem, it's just that it's not held domestically. We need to ask the question, why is that? So that's one thing. Obviously, it reduces private savings and investment. It reduces tax collection. It can create speculative asset bubbles as owners of illicit funds invest in specific assets perceived to be safe havens. It can create unfair competition if certain groups have access to mechanisms of offshore that other companies don't, which gives them an advantage in investment and so on. And it can make the enforcement of development policies more difficult because of the difficulty of disciplining illicit financial interests. To the extent that industrial policy, the role of the state in disciplining and monitoring subsidies and investments is an important part of it, tax evasion and avoidance can hinder that. But I also think, one of the probably most egregious effects it can have is that it makes the use of tax incentives and tax holidays less effective. If it's easy for big business groups to evade tax, what do they care if you have an incentive? They're already evading it anyway. They don't need a zero tax holiday because they don't pay tax in the first place. So it's very difficult to actually use the tax system as an incentive for industrialization if the biggest players are not paying a fair share. It also creates a legitimacy problem for the government that if people start to know that the big groups have all their money abroad and are benefiting from everything, it's more difficult for people to buy into the sacrifices you need to make for industrial policy to work. And I think one way of, and finally, this is related to Dr. Browderham's piece, is that Albert Hirschman wrote what I think is one of the most important political economy books in the 20th century, which is called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that book. If you're not, I would highly recommend everyone read it. It's quite a short book. And Hirschman's basic argument is that when people have an exit option, they tend to use their voice, that is their political mobilization, much less. So for example, in economics, competition creates exit. If you don't like Coke, you buy Pepsi. You can exit, and that's what that competition creates a discipline on managers of the two companies, because if they're producing garbage, consumers will go to the opposite, to another company. So exit creates a way of discipline. However, Hirschman pointed out that exit can also create problems when we think about public policy. And one of the things he argued was that, when the state has a monopoly over something and you start to introduce private options, and people can exit the system, and these private options are relatively good for consumers. People that exit a system don't necessarily have an incentive to use their voice. Voice is a shorthand for political protest. So for example, if you're a wealthy person in Latin America and you send your kids to great private schools and use great private health system, you could care less about how the public health system works. And if there's a lot of very powerful people that don't have an incentive to use their voice because they've exited the system, those people who are potentially the people that are most influential, putting pressure on the government to provide good public services, don't have any incentive to do so. So I think one of the biggest problems of tax evasion and capital flight and tax avoidance is whenever there's a problem in a country and capital just flies out of the country because people have exit options because of deregulated financial markets and so on and so forth, they have less of an incentive to use their voice to sort out the problems. So big business, if they have their money in Mauritius, in the Cayman Islands, in London, in New York, or wherever, are not probably exercising their voice. And this is breaking that link, that dialogue that can be created, that tax creates, if you're forced to deal with the government because you don't have an exit option, then maybe more cooperative solutions become possible. And this is possibly why some of the most successful developmental state stories have capital controls that were part of them. In China, in South Korea, and Taiwan in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, capital control, Brazil for a long time, had capital controls and that in some sense forced big domestic business groups to deal with the government. And so I think if there's one aspect about tax evasion and avoidance that's very negative, and Africa has the biggest level of capital flight as a percentage of GDP, is that the big business groups are not exercising their voice with the government because they do not have to. And if that problem is not solved, it's very difficult to see how an institutionalized and political constructive relationship around industrial policy is going to develop in a sustainable way. On the other hand, there's a lot of literature on how this is all bad. But we also need to be open to the fact that is there empirical evidence to suggest it always and really matters a lot? Open capital markets, some people argue that open capital markets and exit options discipline governments against appropriation of property, unsustainable macro policies, excessive taxation, and so on and so forth. Milton Friedman made the argument a long time ago that actually open capital markets are really good for disciplining governments to do the right thing. So that's a counter argument to, say, Hirschman's exit voice fair. I think it's important to consider these arguments, even if we don't agree with them ideologically. It's important to consider them because the evidence seems to bear out that it doesn't matter as much as people think, whether we have tax evasion and avoidance. Secondly, the use of offshore, at least not in terms of industrial policy, I think it makes a very big difference in terms of income distribution around the world. The use of offshore, Jason Sharman, who's at Cambridge, an Australian economist, has argued that can increase FDI by reducing transaction costs if investors trust the legal system of tax havens in the case of commercial disputes. So as a matter of fact, 30% of India's inward direct comes from firms that are basically shell companies and Mauritius. 25% of Brazil's comes from the Netherlands. 60% of China's come from Hong Kong and the British Virgin Islands, effectively offshores. And Sharman argues that when, and here we see corporate tax rates have declined, we see tax havens, and this is the OECD. They've declined everywhere, but tax havens actually have a very similar corporate tax rate to OECD countries these days. And Sharman pointed out, as the rate got lower, if you're using a tax haven just to avoid tax, you should have seen a reduction of money in a tax haven as the rates got closer, because if tax avoidance was the reason you were investing there. But he was arguing that actually in the last 25 years, investment through tax haven has been increasing as the difference in corporate tax rates has become less. And so he argues that one of the reasons is if you have a dispute, you trust the legal system of Britain or Mauritius or something instead of in China and India. And so there's a lot of one of the incentives of using offshore is it reduces the transaction cost of doing business. Thirdly, and this is important to remember, whatever we talk about what's lost in the tax gap, there is no econometric evidence that links tax take to GDP growth or investment levels. South Africa and Brazil have some of the highest tax takes amongst middle income countries in the world, over 30%, much higher than India, China, or South Korea. But they have much lower investment rates, right? So just because taxes provide public goods, which makes sense, does not mean that that translates into high investment rate. But the investment climate depends on having an effective industrial policy and lots of other things. And so not just taxation. Otherwise, so it's important to remember that just because if we did something about tax evasion doesn't mean you're going to have a wonderful industrial policy in your country. And so we have to think about what is the causation. Is tax avoidance the result of ineffective industrial policies and the investment climate, or vice versa? I'm going to end on a sort of political economy point on why do we see a lot of tax evasion? Next slide. And the tolerance for it has increased. I think one of the things that's important to remember is that most of the international advocacy for doing something about tax havens has not begun in less developed countries. This has been led by the Norwegians, and it was particularly important after the 2008 financial crisis, when that created a huge fiscal hole in the United States and in Western Europe and OECD countries. And then all of a sudden, you see everyone talking about tax havens in the North, in the global North. This wasn't something that started in the global South. And we need to ask that question, if tax evasion is really affecting less developed countries badly, why weren't they leading? Mick Moore has a very good book called Taxing Africa, along with old Felstead. They make this point that the political advocacy really started in the global North. So why is that? I think one of the things to remember about the last 30 years is that a lot of the levers of state formation and political order have been taken away from a lot of leaders. So economic liberalization has taken away subsidized credit, use of state-owned enterprises, the use of tariffs. So the state has lost a lot of patronage mechanisms or ruling coalitions around the continent. And this, just because it's lost some levers of patronage, it doesn't mean that ruling coalitions stop using patronage to other elites to maintain order. So one of the things liberalization has brought in is a use of other mechanisms to create patronage and patronage structures. Now, Douglas North and his colleagues, Weingast and Webb, wrote a famous article in 2007 called Limited Access Orders. They asked a quite simple question that they say economists never ask, which is, how is political order maintained in a country? And North argues that the first question a development economist should answer is, why is there not a civil war in your country? Before you ask anything else, you have to ask, why is there political peace? And they argue through history that most countries maintain order by a structure of what they call limited access orders. That is, North argues that the Hobbesian problem of violence is usually created by other elites that are disaffected by their distribution of wealth that they get, and they either take up a faction of the military or cause rebellion. And North asks the question, how is that problem of solving an elite factional violent fighting solved? And he argues that it's solved by giving economic rents and privileges to relevant elites through what he calls a kind of elite bargain. Now, an open access order is a system of advanced democratic countries with this political and economic competition. North argues that most countries are set up, there's a system of privilege, of high levels of rents, which are kind of super profits or privileged access to wealth in the form of access to land, access to a great job in the state-owned enterprise, access to foreign exchange, access to an import license, things that create an oligarchy. Right? And for this to be valuable, North argues, you need to restrict economic competition, because if your access to a valuable rent is competitive, then it's no longer that valuable. So what you see when you walk down any capital city is a small center that looks like Zurich and everyone else living in a shanty town. And this goes on decade after decade after decade. And North argues that this system, you would ask, how is this tolerated decade after decade? He argues that because elites have incentives to buy in to the ruling coalition because they get lots of goodies for it. Now, without going into any more of the details of this, most countries kind of look like that. The big development question is, why do some of these limited access orders become South Korea in a very rare instance, and most of them grow less dynamically? But they all start out that way, North argues. But when we think of this elite bargain, and we think of the fact that liberalization has taken away a lot of patronage levers, what we're seeing is the use of offshore has been a very important way, both not only the decline of corporate tax rates, but the use of offshore has been a very important mechanism, this tolerance for tax evasion, as a way of maintaining rents in the elite bargain. So we need to understand the logic of why this is going on and why is it tolerated from a high-level political perspective. So, exploring tax patterns can illuminate important insights into the shape and character of elite bargains, which North argues is central to maintaining order. At the same time, the nature of elite bargains provides a window into the political limits of expanding tax capacity in the country. Last slide. I've done some work on this at LSE a few years ago. And so what does this mean for LDC tax policy? Just so high levels of tax evasion are generally tolerated when you look at the last 20 years. Right? There's a close connection between state officials and business elites. There's negligible collection of urban and rural property taxes. There's negligible levels of income tax. These are things that affect, when we think of elites, these are the groups that would pay the most of it. We don't see any of it. Relatively low rates of taxation on agriculture, which are part of investment incentives, but tend to benefit elite landowners and particularly large farmers and agro-processors. There's been a significant decline in the corporate tax burden on big businesses, which has benefited both foreign firms, particularly mining, and political and economic elites. And if we don't think this is important, we have to ask the following question, which is an empirical fact. Virtually no mining deal in oil or minerals or fuels is a public document in sub-Saharan Africa. What's the secret? Where are they hiding it from? I would argue that this is part of the way the elite bargain and the patronage structure has transformed from the use of the old structures that state intervention provided. But this is one of the ways you see adaptation of the rent distribution system of the elite bargain, and we're seeing it via a tolerance for a vastly increased offshore and tax evasion industry. And so when we try to think of tax reform, we need to, I would argue, we need to think of this political challenge. Because if at the very top level, there's not a lot of incentives to do something about this, nothing else will follow. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That's the thought. Without wasting any time, over to you. Thank you.
Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Nishal. I'm based at TIPS, and what I'll present here is a paper I put together for TIPS a little while ago before I joined. And I'll say that a lot of it is rather speculative. So I'm interested in kind of thinking together and welcome any more feedback and criticism, etc. Next slide, please. So I'll just go very quickly over some introductory issues, some interesting discussions around definitions and these kinds of things. Look at it very quickly at a number of case studies that are presented in the paper and what some policy implications I think that we could draw from those cases. And then, the real speculative part, what we in the paper are kind of exploring is what are the channels through which illicit financial flows, offshore wealth, tax havens, all these kinds of things, the channels through which they affect industrial development in South Africa in particular. And we can hear about this broader discussion. So, just to note, we'll go quickly through the stuff at the beginning. Quite a lot of the definitions of illicit financial flows in particular turn on illegality, right? So I think this is from Tax Justice Network. They define illicit flows as international movements of money where funds are generated, transferred, or used illegally. And I think in the South African context, in the kind of policy and enforcement environment, that's very much the kind of outlook. From what I can tell, and we want to kind of put forward another perspective, which is that profit shifting, misalignment, whether it's illegal or not, between where profits are declared and where they're actually generated, is fundamentally harmful. And the paper kind of turns on Mushtaq Khan and colleagues' definition, which you see at the bottom there, which is that we define illicit financial flows as cross-border flows that are illegitimate. Because they're based on an abuse of power and cause harm to society. So in this definition, the illegality is really not the main thing that we want to focus on. Go to the next one, please. We can skip this, but just to say that in the paper, there's a kind of discussion of the various ways of categorizing the kind of the latest in the debate about measuring illicit flows. So this just lays out some of the, one of the ways of organizing different illicit flows and illustrates the, great variation and relatedly the difficulties in estimating illicit flows that can be organized by the mechanism, by the motivation, by the harm. And I think the main point I think we take away from this and that's made in the paper is that a kind of illicit element can be built into almost any cross-border flow. Whether it's in the trade channel, in the capital account, intragroup, intracompany transfers are a major and seemingly the main channel, I would suggest. And yeah, hard to estimate, and then as a result, it's not hard to isolate the impact of illicit financial flows on particular sectors. Of course, it creates a problem for saying clearly and establishing very strongly empirically what are the impacts on industrial sectors, particularly. So let's get all of these kinds of caveats out of the way as we go. Go to the next slide, please. Then on the issue of tax havens and offshore wealth, I think probably all of us has a rich history in film and these kinds of things that give us a stereotypical image of a tax haven. It's a Caribbean island, it's a Swiss banker, it's these kinds of things. And some of the arguments that we've drawn on paper would suggest that this is not really a helpful way to understand these issues, and that tax havens and offshore wealth is fundamentally about a set of capabilities, and the main functions of these capabilities is to provide, one, secrecy. Generally, funds that are being transferred offshore, if it were to be public, that the actors involved, there would be social or otherwise consequences, right? So secrecy is the main, or the first thing. And secondly, security. Third, of course, tax minimization is often a major motivator, and of course the kind of remote access and management of those funds. So once it's an illicit flow and it's offshore, it doesn't just sit there, it's reinvested, it generates secondary income streams, right? A number of other reasons why I would suggest that looking at tax havens and offshore wealth as a capabilities thing rather than a jurisdictions thing is that it enables a focus on specific sets of actors. Who are the enablers? Who are the service providers? Who are their clients? It's a more focused kind of question. And rather than trying to maintain lists of, well, this country is a tax haven, this one isn't, highly political, obviously, and to some extent, as I mentioned in the second point, there, avoids problems associated with kind of setting an arbitrary threshold. Is a country with a tax rate below X a tax haven? It's I think a more productive approach with more policy elements, particularly. And then related to this as well, enables a high degree of specification, right? So again, there's not just one type of tax haven. There's a kind of, and there's a spectrum of the degree to which different jurisdictions provide different services. And this degree of specification allows us to distinguish between different types of tax havens. Intermediary versus destination, for example. So intermediaries usually, in some of the literature we've drawn on, maybe the Caribbean island, the funds flow out of South Africa, maybe they go to Mauritius as the intermediary, but where do they end up? That's the destination haven. That may be largely in the US, UK, larger countries. And then, you can also distinguish between the particular types of services. The main set of capabilities provided in a particular jurisdiction by particular actors. Is it about secrecy, or is it about providing the low tax rate? So that's just, I think that's the end of the introductory issue. We can continue there. So I'll move on to a set of the case studies that we looked at in the paper. The first one is of London. I think we're all familiar with London. I think they're divested now, but they were the owner of the Marikana mine. Just over 10 years ago, the massacre took place. And Dick Forsland and AITC's work on looking at London's books and what they could find in the public sphere, I think provides a useful model of some of the particular ways that a company may operate, take advantage of these financial flows and tax haven networks, right? So, of course, the head company is in London, the mine itself is in South Africa. The platinum group metals are mined here, but they're traded through a trading company, a subsidiary in Bermuda. a jurisdiction where no income tax on individuals or firms, no capital gains tax, no branch profit tax, etc., no transfer pricing legislation, a range of capabilities and services that this particular jurisdiction provides. And the South African subsidiary pays the Bermudan subsidiary hundreds of millions of rands per annum over many years. Right? Sales commissions paid to sales agents in Bermuda over the years, but this subsidiary has no staff. There's no one there, right? And I think in some of the court papers, the company actually conceded that in fact the metal is traded from South Africa, although those capabilities exist here. But there's no commercial rationale for why those hundreds of millions flow through this other jurisdiction, except to avoid taxes. And I think that an interesting point, I think that again Dick Forslund and AIDC make is that, I think it does need to be tested empirically, but they make the argument that it's not just revenue losses. We also need to look at wage losses and dividend losses, right? If a company, as a result of paying these if the South African subsidiary, as a result of paying these hundreds of millions over years, is less profitable, then there's less scope for negotiation with its workers. It says, sorry, if only we were more profitable, we would be able to negotiate a higher wage. Sorry, we've got to pay these massive fees over there. There's not that much left. You can't negotiate with you for an increase. And if you I don't think they've been able quite to quantify the impact of that over the years, which I think the logic of it makes sense, and it's kind of a plausible case, which should be interesting to see, whether there's a viable empirical strategy to establish this. And so, of course, the policy implications, we need to look at the frameworks. What are the existing policies and frameworks regulating overseas trading? And it's not just one. There's many South African companies that have a trading branch in Bermuda or Singapore or whatever it may be, Mauritius, there's no commercial case to be made for why there's this massive outflow of funds. So I think it's clear that it's a fiction. So reviewing these frameworks and trying to see how these loopholes can be plugged, and if they can be plugged, I think the political economy is complicated. Would be one of the things we discussed in the paper. Sorry, this is just the kind of organigram of some of our structures, and an additional element to this case study is that again, one of the South African subsidiaries took a huge loan from the Bermuda subsidiary, and then there's additional outflows and interest payments, which I know that there's a Treasury paper out recently exploring, kind of reviewing the rules around excessive debt financing. So there's some interesting developments there. What comes of that, those kinds of policy reviews, I think would be an interesting process to track. Go to the next one. I think I'll skip this one. It's MTN, but it's essentially similar things, right? MTN, it's intellectual property, it's branding, it's trademarks, it's at the bottom there, know-how, technical expertise, back office support. We are asked to believe is located in Mauritius, where again there's maybe 2 staff or something like this, right? In fact, all of these things take place in South Africa, but this is used to generate outflows from MTN's subsidiaries on the African continent through Mauritius, through Dubai, and you can see that in the first point. So it's not insignificant amounts of money. It's 3% of revenues from MTN Uganda, 9.6% of revenues from MTN Ghana, etc., etc. It's large outflows as a result of this. I think we can skip this one. It's got some similar dynamics. This case study is of De Beers by Sarah Bracken and Khadija Sharif, and they look at the diamond industry. They look at De Beers, right? And I think I'm not going to go into the kind of mechanics of the case study, but one of the main points that they make is that, or one of the factors that allows De Beers to do what it does, it's mostly overpricing of imports, underpricing of exports, is that the government regulators responsible for this particular area appears to be ill-equipped to actually do this job, and it lacks access to information, to just basic information that it requires to do its job. And I think I think the policy point to take from there is that if we are going to regulate these areas better and prevent certain types of outflows, you're going to need value chain specific, industry specific, and in this case with diamonds, which is an exceptional case, product specific capabilities in the state to actually properly manage these industries. So if you could just give me a 2-minute warning.
There's your chair.
Okay, time is short, so I'll skip this one as well, but you get the picture. There's some similar, there's a particular set of arrangements which are currently tolerated for whatever reasons, and that shouldn't be. In this particular case, it's British food companies acquired Illovo, and it's Solar Plus should produce across a range of countries, and it uses similar kind of arrangements to reduce its tax liabilities on the continent. And I think, the point I make there at the bottom is that I think from a South African perspective, it's important for us to establish what are these ways in which South Africa actually facilitates extraction from our neighbours, right? It happens to us as well, but we're also facilitating extraction from the rest of the continent, acting as a conduit for these flows. Okay, on to the speculative stuff. So as I said at the beginning, the nature of these arrangements makes it hard to estimate. There's big debates, a lot of really interesting methodologies to measure these things, but it's very difficult, and it's, I think, maybe even more difficult to work back and say, okay, there's been an outflow of X from South Africa. What has been the effect on the manufacturing sector? What has been the effect? It's a complicated exercise. But it's an interesting gap in the literature on this, which focuses on revenue loss, which would be interesting to see whether using the SOAS treasury database, innovative new methods, whether we can make some progress on this front. But the question motivating the paper was, let's try and figure out, we'll just theorize a bit, what are the channels through which tax motivated illicit flows, profit shifting, etc. may affect, or may be affecting industrial development in South Africa. These next two slides just illustrates where South Africa is in terms of its investment. This is gross fixed capital formation on the left in relation to upper middle income benchmark, on the right in relation to some peer economies. We have an investment problem, we know this. And the next slide illustrates, maybe click it again and we'll highlight, should bring up the little thing that in the statistics on underutilization of capacity, the main reason given is insufficient demand. We have basically a problem in these two channels, which we can link through to levels of investment, for sure, in manufacturing. If we go to the next slide, drawing on the literature on capital flights also helps us to establish what may be some linkages between these types of outflows. Both like in Dikubana, there's evidence that capital flight has a negative effect on monetary policy targets, depletes savings in the economy, constrains investment, arguably reduces output. More recent work by draining, I'll summarize, leave it with this. By draining domestic savings, capital flight erodes investable capital and slows capital accumulation in the source country. And then that point by Dick Forsland that profit shifting results not only in tax revenue losses, but also in what is called wage avoidance and dividend avoidance, implying also negative impact. So there's a lot of work in South Africa linking low investment to poor performance in manufacturing. I think it's at least plausible that these outflows worsen those problems. That's the big argument. The outflows also want to argue that it's plausible that profit shifting disrupts the process of linking back from our kind of large, profitable lead firms, highly concentrated sectors. When these firms are artificially low in profitability, I think it's plausible to say this really constrains what industrial policy and policymakers can weakens in a negotiating position. Right? If a hugely profitable firm, already a profitable firm, like let's say Raman was here, if you want to impose some local content requirements, any kind of industrial policy tools, them artificially lowering their profitability really undermines government in those kinds of things, and suggesting that there's some evidence, at least in the paper by 2016, illustrates that the linkages between mining and manufacturing have kind of weakened significantly in both South Africa, and suggesting it's worth looking into the extent to which these outflows can have contributed to these dynamics. Next, please. Competitive distortions as well, increasingly considered to provide an unfair competitive advantage. It's been recent work in the South African context. Vian and Reynolds, they work on the National Treasury and SOAS database, find that South African-based subsidiaries of tax-haven-based parent firms underreport their profits by up to 80%. Right? So you can imagine the competitive disadvantage that this puts domestic firms, or in general compliant firms, are in relation to firms which have access to these capabilities. And again, the second last point there, if on a sectoral basis, if these large firms are really reporting low profits, perhaps this also discourages new entrants. When investors make a decision, do we go into sector X with a particular level of profitability? Okay, well, profitability seems weak there, we won't invest there, there won't be a new entrant in that sector, and the concentration that may exist in that sector is kind of further entrenched. If incumbents are made to appear less profitable than actually are. Elsewhere in the world, I think in the EU, at the time that we were writing this, and the US as well more recently, there's been interventions by competition authorities on this kind of basis. I think these still skip, but just skip it very quickly, except just to say that the PIC and the IDC, from looking through what's publicly available from their lending portfolio, are exposed to a range of firms that appear quite clearly to have links, bases, and relationships with tax havens. This is a problem in the context of really scarce development or development finance resources. And yeah, lastly, just that from the evidence on the scale of illicit financial flows in South Africa, it's clear that there are massive rents associated with illicit financial flows. They create new incomes that would not exist and large existing income streams that would be smaller if illicit financial flows are not taking place. And I think the point to derive from that is that the people who are benefiting from that will expend resources. They will act to undermine the irrelevant institutions and agencies from intervening. So if we just go to the next one, I think we can leave it there and we come back hopefully to some of those debates and discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. Very complex topic. Same challenge, but different dimensions. Adeyemi, over to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. The last point that you directed me, I think is the most important point. It's an incredibly complex area, and it's getting even more complex given the types of analytical insights that I imagined even this morning. I think a lot of work has been done around illicit financial flows, which of course tax is said to account for about 66%, and a lot of work has been done around industrial policy. But there's still a lot of scope to see how those outflows impact on industrial development. And so I think it's a very important topic that we're addressing this morning. I just want to make a few points. I don't have a presentation. The reason I don't have a presentation is precisely because I do a lot of work around industrial policy. I do a lot of work around tax, but I haven't had the opportunity to sort of synthesize my thinking in those two areas. First of all, I would say we should not be too exercised about volumes. There's something about us economists, we're always looking for the figures, as if that's what matters most. It helps to understand the scale, but we shouldn't be too exercised about it. In the case of tax evasion, tax avoidance, the whole idea is to hide it. So you're not going to find those figures waiting for you. And so, of course, you have to be innovative, and there will be different types of studies. I think John made that point also. There are just all sorts of studies all over the place, and you come up with different things. I think Nishal's presentation also talked about it. So I'll give you a figure, for instance. I don't know how many of you know that the OECD also did some work with the South African Treasury, and using the method of just how much South African capital was found in international financial centers, estimated that maybe the outflows were in the order of 3.5 to $5 billion annually, about 1% to 1.5% of GDP. So what I'm trying to say is that you will use different methods, you get different figures, but you will see that something is happening there. And that's what I think the Mbeki panel also tried to show, is that whatever measurement you use, it's high and it is increasing. I think that's the first point that I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make, and it's been made severally, is that, of course, the less taxes that you have, the less possible it is for the state to provide the services that it's expected to deliver, for the simple reason that it's through tax revenues that the state is able to provide services. And so we're not only talking about the link, and I'll get to that production, but we're getting about the link to even the ability to send children to school, the ability to provide hospitals is also a central part of making sure that you get as much tax as possible from the activities that are undertaken in your economy. And I agree, and I think some of the insights provided by Nishal are very important also, as to how this tax transfers, call it aggressive tax avoidance, if you will, call it tax avoidance, if you will, call it tax evasion, if you will. And I don't mind the definitions, be it illicit, be it, what's the other term Mushtaq used? Illegitimate. You are causing harm one way or the other, which is what I like about that. You are causing harm. So resources that could have been used and reinvested are being taken out. And that's where the core of the issue for me is that we spend a lot of time looking for foreign direct investment. So what are we doing? We're giving incentives to attract somebody to come here and do business. And he's taking our incentives, but guess what? He's also taking out what he owes us in taxes. And so you're wondering really what's the purpose of these incentives if ultimately you're not going to get any benefit from the tax that derives from those activities. And so I tend to agree that there's a lot to do around the whole issue of industrial policy, the whole FDI issue. Shouldn't we be thinking more closely about how we attract FDI as a foundation for industrial policy? On the other hand, of course, we have limited resources. And so, of course, we are always looking for additional inflows to supplement investment in the economy. So it's an important area. I think also, and I like that point that came out in the presentations as well, that there is an element of unfairness to domestic companies. So I'm competing against you in this space. To attract you, my government has given you incentives, Pioneer or some incentive to attract you. You come, not only are you attracted, you're given an incentive, of course, then you use base erosion and profit shifting to take out some of the money. And I'm having to cope with the full impact of tax within my own economy without any recourse. So don't be surprised when you see some of the large corporations suddenly making it seem like a nice thing that, oh, suddenly we moved our headquarters to London. Suddenly we moved our headquarters to New York. I don't think it's love. I think it's just basically an attempt to also be able to benefit from some of the things that the foreign multinationals are benefiting from. But I just want to sort of narrow down my intervention this morning. A lot of what has been said is very useful, very insightful, and I'm sure you've all seen the Mbeki report. So all those things around the financial fields, I'm sure you'll find very interesting. But the point I want to make this morning in particular is that we should pay close attention to the global tax initiative. this new tax deal that has been offered as the solution to basic notion of profit shifting. And the whole idea, if you know about the OECD two-pillar outcome, I think was pillar one that dealt with trying to get multinational companies above $20 billion and a profitability margin of 10% to be taxed centrally, so to speak, whereby everybody then gets a share of the cut of what is due to them based on sales in their countries. And then the second pillar, of course, is about ensuring that you have a bottom floor for tax competition. So we're trying to get every multinational to pay at least 15% anywhere in the world. I'm just broadly speaking around those issues. But the reason I'm trying to bring it out is that there's the feeling that the Global Tax Initiative will help to solve for most of the tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. And I'm saying that perhaps so, but perhaps more so in the developed economies. You know, in other words, you may just find that for the developing countries, you may even be signing up to something that is even worse than what you have now. I mean, it's a controversial thing to say, but fortunately I'm from Nigeria and we're one of the four that did not sign. So I'm able to say that without worrying too much. Other civil servants have to be careful. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that the first thing that various studies have shown that it really doesn't amount to much money for our countries. Kenya did some analysis, maybe 11 firms will be caught in that net. Nigeria, I think 6 will be caught in that net. Partly, of course, also because the companies that do the most work in our countries are excluded, the financial services and extractive sectors. So what you then have is a situation in which there's not really much in it for us. But to compound that, one of the requirements is that you then have to give up your legislation on what we call significant economic presence or digital taxes, your own domestic digital taxes. As part of the deal, you drop your domestic digital taxes and then sign up to the global deal. The problem with that is that many of the companies that do the business in our countries are not in scope, even those in the digital companies are not in scope of 20 billion. So again, what's in it for us revenue-wise, and then why do we have to give up what we are already getting? And there's a comparison with other possible scenarios. I think it's called Article 12 of the UN tax treaty. And analysis done by the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa and the South Center, analysis done by the G24, analysis done by Oxfam have all shown that in real terms, you're not going to get much money out of this agreement the way it is organized. But I think another element which goes to the political economy is that it requires you to sign up to binding arbitration, mandatory and binding arbitration in Washington. Now that has two implications. Two implications is reduces your tax sovereignty. So I don't really, and the point will come if you look at what John was saying, I don't really have to deal with you. I just exit and go deal with the issues in my own society and having the lawyers and the accountants I can afford, which we can't afford. Notice Nigeria didn't sign, Pakistan didn't sign. One of the key reasons is that we've been at the receiving end of nasty international arbitration judgments that don't make any sense. You know, the arbitration judgments in the case of Nigeria and the company that have not done a single thing, one arbitration in London to the tune of about $10 billion. At that time, perhaps 1/4 of our gross reserves. You know, and so what you're going to do then is you're going to find yourself being taken to those places to solve those issues, which should be solved domestically. So I think that's one of the reasons. But because a lot of these things also rely on tax capacities, what you're going to find is that you don't have in the public sector, in the revenue services, the kind of accountants, financial experts, lawyers that can cope with the accountants, financial experts, and lawyers, not only of the developed economies that you'll be negotiating with Washington. But even with the MNCs, they can afford to pay much better. When we were working on the DECI panel, one of the persons who made a presentation to us and gave us all the examples that Nishal gave about the experiences they had had with multinational corporations. After giving us this nice, wonderful briefing, they told us, well, that's it. I'm joining XYZ next week. So the person who even understands what is going on has gone to the other side to help them to know how to better pay those taxes. So the point I'm trying to make is that the global tax deal really things even further because it provides avenues for exit, perhaps also because it really doesn't touch on the things that we are most worried about. And listening to Nishal, it doesn't touch, for instance, the issues of thing capitalization. So it seems to think that the only problems you have are because there's no physical presence. The digital companies, the Googles and Amazons, once you solve for them, you solve for all of us. But most of the people who do business and who engage in tax evasion, the methods they use are not captured in the global tax initiative, sort of the intercompany tax, thing capitalization type issues, and the profit shifting issues, the branding, and all those things that they used, those very, very good examples to show that these things happen in ways that are not captured by the global tax initiative. So I just want to end there by saying I think it's a very important area of study. I think not only should we be studying how it works for us at home, but we should pay close attention to how international tax rules are being reframed in a manner that may further undermine our development objectives, especially productive activities, either indeed in agriculture or indeed in the industrial sector. I'll leave it there now. I'm willing to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Looking at my time, so if I'm not mistaken, I'm supposed to finish at 12.
Yeah.
So we have about 45 minutes to discuss this issue. So I don't want to abuse my position here and asking questions. I'd like to allow the audience to ask and engage the scholars if you differ with what they're saying. Raise that. TIPS, it's a learning organization. APORDE is meant to develop critical scholars to robustly debate African development. All right, so I have my own issues, which I will then come and raise later. But let me open it up for you to ask questions. Over to you, and please introduce yourself and where you come from in terms of your organization. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Leila Kachui, and I'm from the African Tax Administration Forum. And listening to the conversations, it's quite intriguing to hear the various aspects coming out in terms of the conversations around tax and financial flows and the impact that it does have on African economies as well. And insights given, especially from Adeyemi, I really resonate with them because that's roughly around the work that we do. Maybe if I may just give you a bit of a briefing about the African Tax Administration Forum. We are an international organization developed by African revenue authorities in Africa to serve the people of Africa through the revenue tax administrations. And one of our key partners in this is the South African Revenue Authority, of course, which is also hosting us here in South Africa. Just listening to the conversations, I was trying to see from the three presenters how they could possibly bring this back home to Africa in the context of the resources that are actually lost in the African context and the implications therein. And I'm speaking about this considering some of the approaches that we have had with working with revenue authorities, as well as the aspects within the African Union, and also conversations that we are having with the OECD, particularly talking about the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 solutions and the race to the bottom and the implications also has on African states. What exactly would the three presenters be opting for as an alternative solution for Africa to consider in its process to ensure domestic resource mobilization? I'd just like to leave it there as a general conversation, but maybe also just to maybe consider some of the solutions that Africa has been able to develop as well, and how exactly do they think these are either practical solutions or possibly areas that as African countries we may need to consider to improve on these aspects already. Thank you.
My name is Dumsan Changes. What I get the views of the colleagues presenting on the unilateral approaches to dealing with African continental issues, because clearly, looking at the way the OECD conversation is going, clearly, small countries will not benefit as they want to, but there has always been a conversation around unilateral approach to international tax laws. And it has gained quite grounds. Many of some of the OECD member states are actually in favor of the OECD framework itself. So I want to get the views of your thoughts on it. But I think the issue that has been kept in mind over time is the issue of the international investment rules. What role do they play in really enabling these tax avoidance or illicit transaction activities? Is there a need to really reform international investment rules? Because there's perception that these international investment rules leads to more investments, particularly in less developed countries, which when you look at the evidence, quite really mixed whether there is a need there is actually a benefit the way they seem to be. Is there a need to reform international investment rules in line with? I think I wrote a paper sometime back where I think one of the African countries, I don't know, it's Ghana, where they started shifting away from saying, they attract investments for the sake of it, but the investment rules ought to look into their developmental objectives. Is there an opportunity to really talk about that approach in terms of investment rules and how are these enabling tips of avoidance? So thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I'm Christopher Kramer. I'm from SOAS. Forgive me, this is not an area I know enough about, so I'm trying to kind of make a little bit more sense of some of these presentations, which were really helpful, really, really interesting, all three, and thank you for that. A couple of sort of clarification things that shift into a bigger question. One is, Jonathan, you talked about Mauritius. Was it more difficult? Was it more difficult in Mauritius to avoid tax in a small island economy in a pre-digital globalization era? Is it a relevant case, in other words, for contemporary South Africa, Nigeria, etc., etc.? Second thing, again for you, Jonathan, is that in one of your charts slides, you were talking. I wasn't quite sure about the relationship between the tax take and tax avoidance. You seem to be using one to imply the other. I mean, if you have a low tax take, it doesn't necessarily mean there's high tax avoidance. It could be about the policy. And so I kind of, I think I'm not in favor of tax avoidance in the slightest. But there are so many complicated causal relationships that if we want to understand the links from tax avoidance mechanisms and channels to industrial policy specifically, I kind of want to know what we actually know and what we don't a bit more clearly. And in that line, Nishal, I don't know. I'm not initially that happy with mush tax definition because I think it's rather subjective and arbitrary. Who says? Can't we have different views about what's abuse of power or about what harms society? And I think we probably would all agree in this room, but a lot of people wouldn't. And therefore, we need a slightly tighter definition, I would have thought. And I think that becomes relevant when we begin to ask, well, what if much of what we call tax avoidance, and they're being very cross with the firms that do this, the individual capitalists and so on, is actually positively encouraged by and legitimized by power, by society, by states. We've just got a new prime minister in my country, whose new chief economic advisor was the head of the Taxpayers Alliance in the UK, which means the people who prefer not to pay tax in the UK. We have a government in my country, again, which has positively promoted exit, Jonathan, is encouraging people to kind of run away from public sector and the NHS. And, so it's a kind of weird thing, and I wonder whether we have to think more about the kind of the mush of ideology that creates endogeneity between tax takes, tax avoidance, so on and so forth. I'm questioning, sorry if this is unclear and inchoate, but I wonder whether tax avoidance and the lack of industrial policy, or the fragility of industrial policies in some countries, may have a common cause rather than one clearly causing the other. So rather than just pitting, the avoiders against the state, there's a sort of common problem we need to look at. And then we have to think, well, why might that be the case? Is it because states nowadays appear to be able to sustain some form of legitimacy without relying on taxation in quite the same way that the Charles Tilley state did, the state that made war and war that then raped the state through taxation. Do states have less need? Is that because there's less war? Well, not really. Maybe they're paying for those wars in different ways. And to turn that into a hopeful direction, might one then think that now, when clearly political security threats are rising again, including in OECD countries, really pressing global political security issues, when climate security issues are threatening us all and becoming more and more immediate to us all, are we going to see a new need for more effective states, a new need, a new legitimacy around industrial policy? And is that where the source of stronger action is going to come against tax avoidance? Because I have no doubt that the instruments can be found if we want them to be. Sorry, that took a while.
Anyone can respond to those questions. I'll start with you.
I'm not sure I want to answer all of them, but the first question was raised about, revenues lost. One of the problems with the discourse about revenues lost is that tax revenues are actually a very small part of resource mobilization, the lower the income level of a country. So the vast majority of resource mobilization is in the profitability of firms. That's Arthur Lewis's original point in one of the most famous articles in Development Economics. It's about forcing savings. The East Asian experience forced a ton of savings by not allowing car loans, house mortgages. But they limited that type and plowed a ton of money into, that's true of Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore. There's a massive amount of forced savings. This far outweighs how much tax was collected. And so the investment and savings rates of those countries were well higher, not because the tax takes was significantly different. The East Asian countries had a tax take. This is why tax take is important. Very similar to Latin America from 1980 onward, and grew at 3 times the rate. So now one could break it down and say, did East Asia have more investor-friendly corporate taxes? Not really. Actually, they had very similar policies if you look at them. Was there more tax avoidance or evasion in East? Not really. The data suggests it was quite similar. But I think one of the things is that we need to look at non-tax forms of resource mobilization. Are your SOEs profitable, or are they losing $1 million a day, as they were in Zambia in the 1990s? Right? And so if you're POSCO in South Korea and you're making billions for the state, that's resource mobilization, right? Does ESCOM do that for South Africa? Is it POSCO? That's much more important than tax collection when you look at the broad development story. Ethiopia is a very weak tax collector and has a very high investment rate. It has higher levels of capital flight than South Africa in the last 20 years as a percentage of GDP, and it has a significant industrial policy. So I think partly to answer your question, Chris, as well, is that I think there's been too much attention on just the revenue loss. The link to industrial policy, I think, is actually quite weak because these mechanisms are international. And China and Ethiopia have to deal with an international architecture of this just the way South Africa and Brazil does. And they manage it very differently. So I think it's overplayed. I don't think it makes that much of a difference. And I think the big story is, why is Dangote investing in a refinery now? He could put all of his money, keep it offshore. And so the question is, something's happening in Nigeria that's saying, well, I'm going to add value to oil. That's the story that's most important, not that he's keeping it offshore. So I understand, why is this beginning to happen? The rest of how much money he has offshore to me is irrelevant. The question is, you could make a lot more in return being a successful emerging producer in a less developed country. You could make 50, 100, 200% rate of return. Why do you want to have a 3%, 5% rate of return in a flat in London when you could make 200? So there's something wrong with the production incentives. There's something wrong with the mobilization, the investment climate, the industrial policy. It's not being facilitated in a way that's attracting these folks who are going to evade tax anyway, because not even the OECD tax collectors can keep track of multinationals. So it's very difficult, as Adeyemi pointed out, to expect tax authorities, and SOAS is one of the most sophisticated ones in the world, actually, to keep a handle on this. It's better to kind of say, well, let's make it really profitable to invest in manufacturing and growth enhancing activities in the country. And yes, let's try to do as much as we can to collect more tax, because it will create a more just distribution of income. I think it's a much more important thing in terms of distribution of income than it is in terms of industrial dynamism. Right? China has become very unequal because of these processes, because a lot of the money is held offshore in Hong Kong. So it's become a very unequal place. The inequality is approaching Brazil now, but it's industrially dynamic, right? So we need to separate those two things. I think in terms of the tax justice, we're denying a lot of spending for, potential pro-poor spending, if you like, on social services. So, I think that's how I would, to answer the question about Mauritius, I do think it was a different world. I also think it was the same world for South Africa back then. They weren't developing as well as Mauritius was. So I think it's the same type of answer. They had a more effective industrial strategy or production strategy, just generally. Tax was a part of that story, wasn't necessarily the most important part. But Brownigan's piece looked at a lot of interviews that made a very big difference to these producers, and so that's why they paid the tax. So it was a kind of micro study. I would say two things about the broader development story. I remember doing some research in Zambia on the mining contracts that were in the late 1990s, and they got the worst royalty rate because they had to IMF forced them to privatize the copper mines and so on and so forth. And the royalty rate they got, if they had taxed what Chile got out of a royalty, they lost something between $10 and $15 billion between 2000 and 2015. That's a lot of money. It was much more than the amount of aid that came in to Zambia, and it was greater than most of the foreign direct investment in the country that they lost in that tax rate. So I would think one thing that would be much more useful to do is that sub-Saharan Africa has a shortage in their Ministry of Mines of knowing how much they have under the ground. And so when they bargain with multinationals that have GPS technology and so on and so forth, they get bad mining deals because they don't have the same knowledge about the value of the minerals and commodities, the minerals and fuels under the ground. And so that's one thing I would invest in is, capacity to negotiate with multinationals, because you have engineers that know your geological survey much more than a lot of these ministries of mines do. And the second thing I would say is, I think the continent probably needs a construction of more national development banks to actually create focal points for more industrial roads. It's a very fragmented story because national development banks are very good at focalizing and increasing the scale of investment. There's a lot of questions. I don't want to talk about all the things. The thing about threat is absolutely right, Charles. So we live in a world today where you don't need to raise taxes to survive because your international borders are the Westphalian system, protected by the community, generally speaking, with a few exceptions. So there's less impetus, and I do think the world needs to probably mobilize threats again. And it looks like climate security is one of them, as well as political insecurity. That may be an impetus. That's a speculative thing. But Tilly's point was that it was when your border is up for threat, your political existence is up for threat. A common pool problem like climate security, I'm not so sure. Right? In the past, if you had a weak economy, you were taken over. One reason why we have so many collapsed and fragile states now is because if you were weak in 1820, you got invaded and you were eliminated from the map. There were no fragile states. Because now you can survive with dysfunctional government and management because it's not legitimate to invade a country and take it over, or at least, well, up till now it hasn't been. So we live in a different world. That's not an advocacy for war, of course, but it is important to understand that tax capacity was related to the fact that you need to raise resources and have a legitimate economy to defend yourself in the past, in a kind of Darwinian struggle. Now there's much less of that incentive. So do we need to mobilize? I think we do need to probably mobilize threats politically as a discourse to increase the impetus for tax collection and reduce the tolerance for these types of evading and avoiding mechanisms that go on. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I of course not going to respond to all the questions. The first one I wanted, I think I reframed the question: how should Africa relate to ongoing reforms in the global tax architecture? And I say that's a very, very good question. It's a very difficult question. It's ultimately international relations. Power matters. People who have the power to write the rules and bring multinationals to him, if they don't write the rules in a way that addresses your concerns, you might not be able to do much about it. So I look at that. Maybe you have three major options. Perhaps first to seek an accommodation. In other words, rather than throw up your hands in the air, is to see whether you can have the thresholds to nowhere, for instance. Just the same way LDCs, I think, small island states got some breaks. Maybe there should be an intermediate category between the 20 minimum $1 million in profit. So maybe look for an intermediate in the negotiating stage. The second, of course, is to work through the United Nations and try and get Article 12 adopted. The problem with Article 12B, of course, is that the people who have the international economic power, if they don't sign up to it, you can get those provisions into bilateral tax treaties. And so it can just become an exercise, become an academic exercise. But I think at the end of the day, the most important is to build capacities. To build capacities not only to handle the intricacies of the tax system, but also build capacities to negotiate across the board. So you don't get the kinds of agreements that you sign up to in resource contracts and the like, which are hidden away. So that's how I'll answer that question. I want to talk a bit about the issue of definitions. And, Chris, I tend to see the point you're making. When we were working on the Makube report, that issue of definition kept cropping up. And the reason it kept creeping up was that a lot of multinationals didn't want you to apply any way that they were involved in illegality. In other words, they're happy for you to talk about tax avoidance or aggressive tax avoidance. But the minute you say it's illegal, then there are consequences. But the difficulty that we had was to say, so you can just continue with this business because some people think it's right. I read a book written by some Swiss guy, quoted one Max Baer, who I think used to be a financial witness, global financial players. And he said, quite frankly, he didn't know the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. But he was saying it from the point of view of saying that tax evasion should be treated as tax avoidance. But I understood him in my own view to say tax avoidance would as well be tax evasion, because you're not paying your fair share of the taxes that are due in the place where you do business. So it was agreed to talk about where the activity is illegal in any of the stages of the transaction, the origin, the transmission, and the destination. So if you breach a law there, so the country that has capital controls, just breaching capital controls by whatever means you have done it, you've already moved into legality. changing the books, misinvoicing, so I think there's a lot to be said about trying to show that we are talking about actions that break the law rather than normative behavior, which, as Chris said, anybody can say, you think that's bad, I think it's good. What do you do about that? So I get the point, but we're always going to struggle with the definition. In our own case, we also struggle because we were also talking about money laundering and corruption. So it was harder to find a definition that sort of suited for all three categories. Then I just wanted to, the last thing I want to talk about is about the whole issue of taxes and domestic resource mobilization. I think we must understand that the issue about investable resources is not only about tax. In other words, yes, government wants the tax take so it can provide social services. But the part of the essential argument is that even if it's not tax and you are taking out money from your country, the profits you make in my country, you are taking out part of the very savings that I need to invest in future activities. So there is an element of taking out the resources by profit shifting based erosion, of reducing the resources that are available for reinvestment in society, which is why the relationship, the multinationals is particularly important. And I just leave you with a thought made by somebody who has done a lot of work in this area. And he said, ultimately, the whole issue of this taking out these resources is linked more to foreign exchange than to avoiding tax, in the sense that it is the scarcity of foreign exchange in those economies that makes people want to take out resources so that they can take out foreign exchange resources rather than tax. It's just a point to ponder. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Just briefly on the issue of definition, I agree that part of Mushtaq's definition in relation with that phrase, I agree that part of the definition is subjective, but is more useful and more fundamental to the definition is the harm, right, which I think can be established, right, by competition authorities. For example, kind of cases to being able to identify. I think there's something to the definition. It's useful. On the OECD plan, I'm by no means an expert in how it functions, but I understand that the kind of formulary apportionment element of that is multinationals being taxed centrally and the proceeds being distributed. My understanding is that apportionment is going to be almost totally biased towards where sales take place as opposed to where production takes place. I think that I don't see that. I mean, obviously that's going to disadvantage developing countries relative to richer countries where markets are larger, where retail prices. I think there's a kind of structural problem there. I don't see that changing. I agree also that it's probably unlikely that the UN is going to assert itself and its Article 12 of the OECD process. And I think the broader issues, and by the way, I agree totally that kind of solving domestic issues, domestic production incentives, production structure is absolutely critical. But I think there is a broader issue here about the nature of our integration as African countries, as South Africa. The nature of our integration with global economy is problematic in so many different ways. With disadvantages in so many different ways. I'm thinking of, for example, for some years now, South Africa's been running a fairly large positive net international investment position. But at the same time, there's a huge deficit in primary income. So South African investors and etc. own a larger stock of overseas assets than overseas investors own South African assets. But the relative returns on those two things are basically, we have a problem of holding low-yielding foreign assets, foreign exchange, for good reasons, for good risk mitigation, etc. While foreign investors get to hold high-yielding South African assets, will be subject to risk premium and these kinds of things. I think these are quite fundamental issues about the nature of the regulation to. Not sure how that gets. I think that interacts with the domestic questions of organization and incentives to provide critical context in which our state has to try and assert itself over multinationals or domestic actors. It's a very challenging, very challenging environment. That's not just domestic. It's not just about domestic organization, but it's
Can Jonathan cover this issues? Or do you want to follow?
Yeah. Okay.
Just to Yanni's point quite important, I think one of the probably most important effects is the foreign exchange. And I think there's a difference between exiting just within the economy versus exiting the economy, right? And so I think the balance of payments and foreign exchange constraint is probably one of the most debilitating things about this. The United States has a different ideology than Western Europe. It's a very dynamic capitalist economy. The ideology is it's a low tax state, at 33% relative to Germany at 50%. There's varieties of capitalism. It's an ideology that promotes low tax on purpose. That's not exit in the sense that the money stays in the US domestic economy. It just goes into investment banks and venture capital funds, and it has a different way of forming resource mobilization. And all of the iconic firms in the last 20 years are from the United States. It doesn't have a problem with capital dynamism, with the low taxes. Japan has a quite low tax rate, so does Australia, so does South Korea. For the movie Parasite, picked that up. Its welfare state is quite small for how rich it's become. They're promoting exit in that sense as an ideology in terms of tax, but most of the money stays within South Korea to be invested at a very high rate. So I think we need to distinguish between varieties of capitalism that have lower tax states with venture capital and investment banks, Germany, Korea, or the United States, versus countries that have bigger welfare states like Germany, the Nordic countries, which have a more corporatist capitalist style that also work. So what Britain's doing may or may not be, Britain's always had a problem with industrial policy anyway, because the City of London has an outsized influence historically. And in some sense, it's kind of like a financial curse, if you like, similar to the research, because it makes so much money historically from finance. South Africa has a bit of that problem as well. So I think it's important to distinguish: is the money exiting the national economy or not? Right? You can organize capitalism with smaller states and be very dynamic in that regard. So I just want to make that.
Thank you. I think my points were not addressed maybe directly, but I think the point I wanted to add, which I think I thought was around, how do I put it? I think the debate around the need to build capacity, to some extent, it's probably outdated or boring debate. I'll say in a way, it really disempowers or bars countries doing in particular for holding stance on serious political economy debates because we don't have capacity. And if evidence shows that actually there's some of the lack of causality between the level of taxes and the level of economic growth or investment, clearly there's a lot more political economic question than more technical question. And I think there has to be a point where the thinking go beyond just, I feel like it's just build capacity, don't get involved in this debate, build capacity in countries. And I think it's in my view, it's a very boring and outdated debate. We need to move away from that, really think about the development and whether, I go back to question whether the way the investment rules are made are in a way made to in a way that will always have investment, tax avoidance, whether we like the way they are set up. And they probably need to think about the reform. The other point that I raised around the universal approach to tax policy, particularly international tax policy, it's a worth debate having, particularly if we're going to have to scrabble around getting the revenues so much we need. Maybe that will force everyone to come to the table. If all start saying, let's go unilaterally. will be forced to come back to the table and say, actually, that might not necessarily work, but maybe it might work in other countries. I think those points will not address. Thank you.
All right. Let me also take the opportunity, to comment and ask questions, and I'm allowing the panelists to.
We've also got one online person as well.
Okay.
Hi. So it's Sydney, and this is Chris, and we're calling in from Germany. And my question is, we're talking a lot about tax avoidance and tax evasion and industrial policy. And a key sort of piece of industrial policy that seems to be somewhat missing from this debate, that does show up in this literature on sort of particularly on capital flight, is that these sort of global structures don't just work automatically. Someone actually has to make them work. And there's actually this like huge industry of consultants and lawyers and banks that function to make this work. If you're like me, an economist, if you look at where American sort of econ students go, like 20 to 30% of our top students, broadly speaking, end up in this industry. So that if you go to a top law school, I imagine this is probably true for South African colleagues who teach economics or some related field, is that we actually, this is a large industry in itself. And I know that there's been some push through banking regulation to use industrial policy to do, at the very low end, something about tax avoidance and tax evasion. But I was wondering if we should be thinking about our strategy, about the tools we have to combat these problems as a form of industrial policy, because it's not like these happen on their own. It's not like sort of someone makes $1 billion and wants to hide it in Switzerland and that just happens. There's like a whole list of people whose profession are to find people who have money and to move it offshore, to sort of to actually make these processes work. And I think we might have potential to interfere in this industry. And you could, yeah. So that's my question, suggestion, and I'm hoping some of the speakers have something to say about it.
Thank you very much for that. My comments are along those lines. I want to focus more on the avoidance part, not the illicit, illegal part of it. I don't think we appreciate the scale in which international finance is changing. And that's where there are incentives for tax avoidance. There are loop structures, right, which can be created by investment companies, accountants, economists, and lawyers. What about them? They are not illegal in nature. Right? So, for instance, in South Africa, there are reforms in the pension, where and that is linked to the exchange controls. The reforms in the exchange controls, increasing the limit in which South African individuals and companies can take their money to offshore countries. That's not illegal, but that will have an impact on industrial development in South Africa, because you are looking at price differentials, right, based on your return investments. So that is tax arbitrage, and that's what you find in this area. Now, how are we going to deal with that? I mean, it's legal, and it goes back to the issue that Jonathan is raising, that the wealthy and powerful will ask for those reforms. So you have the Reserve Bank agreeing that you lower these exchange controls, and the National Treasury, and you have the tax authorities, right, coming in to fight these avoidance measures through the general avoidance rules, right? So, and there is another method that they are using to attack those transactions through simulations, and there is literature developing in this area. Now, these are formal structures which are being allowed by governments. All right, they are not illicit funding. We are creating incentives to move the funding, and also in finance, dual listing of companies. All right, so and the tax treaties and obligations. So if you're primary listing, is not the JSE. We have an obligation, all right, to pay certain taxes where your primary listing is. That's not illicit, all right? That's a development in finance. Your crypto currencies, your e-commerce, all right? So those have an impact on industrial development. And also within certain asset classes, all right? So where you don't have capital gains tax, it's an incentive also if the returns are good in certain asset classes where there's no capital gains tax, but the returns are high. All right, so I will advise that to invest in those. So that is why you see also in the financial markets the development of real estate, investment trusts, the REITs, which can invest globally, and that affect investment in industrial development. And lastly, when it comes to industrial development, percent, and those 2 points, including Nigeria. So we have the SEZ in South Africa, the special economic zones. So we try to attract investments. But from a tax point of view, is the targeting right? Is the design right? Because we might be attracting industries to benefit from those SEZs, because there is lower tax margin, the rates are low. So that might be a negative impact, that you'll be locating companies there that would have in any way made those investments, So how do we then design our incentives broadly? I mean, the issue of PIC, the IEC, so that you minimize these incidents of paying less tax. And lastly, it's about Nigeria. So for years in Nigeria, there's not been investment in the oil refinery. I mean, the point that Jonathan is raising. But we had international oil companies, I think it's Total, Shell, exploring for oil, taking it out, and Nigeria importing refined oil, all right? So that will also have an impact in terms of your exchange rates, your capital flight, and that's not illegal. You need oil to run the economy, right? But money will go out, and that's the point we are raising, Adeyemi, that these multinational companies don't like the element of illegality. They're saying, no, that's how our model is structured. We exploit and sell it back as a refined product. Now there's capital costs, there's industrial costs, because if you lose the production of other byproducts of oil, there is a cost, meaning that we have to import, other byproducts of refined oil in the country. So the move by Dangote to invest in refinery in Nigeria, it's good, because it also deals with formal capital flight, it also deals with tax avoidance, but industrial development. So it's a complex area, all right? And I think domestically, there's no one state institution that can deal with this matter. It's not an issue that can be left to the tax authorities or treasury from a fiscal point of view. There's industrial policy element here. We might be losing investments, not because of capital flight or illicit flight. It's because there are no incentives, or there are incentives in other asset classes and not invest in industrial development. I would appreciate your comments and also contribute.
There's one more hand up.
Okay.
I wanted to agree actually with Tebogo that I think it's a morality issue more than a legality issue. And, I just remember I think I was in Geneva, or I was, around England when they first came out against, I guess, Apple or Google, and discovered they weren't paying tax. They weren't paying enough tax, and it was immoral, but it wasn't illegal. You have lawyers, and somewhere in the discussion, we're talking about capacity. We have capacity. South Africa has capacity. We've got really good lawyers. We've got really good lawyers in London. South Africans are in London working in financial markets. So that's not it. I think we need to just change our focus and, label them illicit financial flows. Label them financial flows and then look at how we can harness them best and how we can protect ourselves. I think in Tanzania a few years ago, they stopped the flow so they attracted a lot of investment, and then all of a sudden they stopped the movement of money out of Tanzania. And a lot of South African money got stuck there, and is probably still stuck there. But that's a problem. You want investors to be able to move their money at the same time. So you have to strike a balance somewhere. And I think that you shouldn't tie in investment either, because that's a whole different discussion. But yeah, when it comes to tax, we want to be fluid as well. We don't want to have old solutions. And yeah, because I hear Jonathan talking about different types of capitalism. I'm not familiar with that idea. I just think that it's different types of instruments that you can have that to resolve something. Yeah, that's all.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. We have run out of time, but I would like to give over to the panelists to conclude.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to comment on the issue you raised around the tax avoidance issue. There's the whole issue of tax competition, which I think is the second pillar of the OECD solution. In other words, a recognition given by the more powerful economies, or not developed economies, that they were also not getting the full extent of tax benefits that should come to them, because some of the multinationals have shifted to their headquarters, to tax havens. And so they've set the floor of 15% worldwide. So if a tax haven charges you, say, only 9% tax, your home country has the right to make it up to 50%. And if your home country also now gives you a bit more leeway, then third countries also have the right, according to how much business you do in the country, to take you up to 15%. The difficulty with that in any instance is that 15% is quite low. So it can still lead to, I think the average tax rates in Africa, tax collection rates in Africa are at about 27%. So there's still a lot of room there for you to also face a lot of tax competition, to shift resources to pay lower taxes elsewhere. So there is indeed an attempt to address that issue we're talking about from the aspect of competition. Whether it will work for African countries is also the question.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add one thing that Adeyemi mentioned about capital flight, is that macroeconomically, apart from balance of payments constraint, the risk profile of countries goes up a lot, simply because there's less foreign domestic savings in the economy. Charlie Robb. So it's not. So there's probably the overall interest rate in the country would be much less than all what Africans owed had abroad were domestic here, because it would be a much greater supply of savings domestically relative to investment demand. So you have a much lower investment, you have a much lower interest rate, which macroeconomically probably leads to greater investment, all things considered. Does that go into shopping malls versus hydrogen power? I don't know, but certainly the investment rate is much higher, and that macroeconomic effect of the balance of payments and the national savings is probably very important.
I think we have come to the end of the seminar. Let me thank the panelists for thought-provoking discussions. There's more work to be done, so my expectation is that TIPS will lead in this area. Let's develop the capacity, and we have the benefit of our colleagues internationally who have always helped South Africa to develop its capacity around these issues. So Yeah, thank you very much and enjoy your week.